Okay, let's take a look at the Redshift lens shaders and how we can use them to get a more lifelike effect in our renders. So there are three lens shaders available to us in Redshift. There's the Redshift Bokeh, Redshift Lens Distortion, and Redshift Photographic Exposure. Lens shaders in Redshift can be set up locally to only affect a specific camera or globally to affect all the cameras in a scene. To attach a lens shader locally to a specific camera, we'll want to first create it in our Hypershade window, and then we'll want to select our camera and plug it into the shaders rollout here underneath the Redshift rollout. So we'll just drag it and drop it into the lens shader slot. If we want to drop extra lens shaders in here, there's also an additional lens shaders list where we can hit create and it'll bring us the create render node window. We'll go to Redshift shader lens and we can select it from the list here. Okay, so again, that's just to assign it locally to this one specific camera. Let's delete those. To apply a lens shader globally and have it affect all the cameras in our scene, we would want to go into our render settings in the output tab, down under the lenses rollout, and we'll see that we have three slots here, one for each of the lens shaders. We can also see there's already a photographic exposure shader active in our scene, and this is because the photographic exposure shader is automatically created as part of the physical sun and sky system in Redshift. So let's look at the attributes for this shader. The photographic exposure shader lets us control our CG camera with physical camera parameters like f-stop, ISO, and shutter speed. So whenever we're using high intensity physical light sources like IES lights or physical sun, having these controls is important to help keep everything from getting blown out. So let's take a look at these first few parameters. So we have film speed ISO, shutter time ratio, and f-stop number. On a real physical camera, these are essentially different ways of controlling how much light actually enters our camera. So ultimately, these three attributes will affect overall brightness. The first one, film speed ISO, is basically how sensitive our film is to light. So a higher value means our film is more sensitive and results in a brighter image, and vice versa. So if we double this to 200, for instance, we can see our image getting significantly brighter, whereas if we bring it down to 50, our film is less sensitive to light and our image as a result is darker. The next one, shutter time ratio, controls how long our film is actually exposed to light. So here it's expressed as a ratio of 1 second, so a value of 100 means that our film is exposed to light for about 1/100th of a second, whereas a value of 8, for instance, means that our film is exposed to light for 1/8 of a second, so a lot longer time, and a value of 30, for instance, means 1/30th of a second. So of course with this parameter, the higher the number is, the darker our overall image will be, and a lower number will result in a brighter image. So finally here we have the f-stop number. So in a physical camera, the f-stop controls the size of the opening where light can enter. This is also a ratio value, so again, the larger the value we put here, the darker our overall image will be, and vice versa. So if we were to, let's say, set this at 30, we're going to see the opening for light to enter our camera is a lot smaller, and therefore our image is darker, whereas if we set this to 2, we have a much bigger opening and a lot more light can enter. So we'll set that back to 8. Okay, so that's the basics of these first three controllers. These should be pretty intuitive for users who are familiar with photography, but for users who would rather just have a single slider for overall brightness, using this film speed parameter should do the trick. Okay, so next up is this white point feature. So this parameter lets us define which color values should be neutralized in our image and displayed as white. So here, for instance, we have two warm colored light sources from the sun and from this lamp over here. If we set this warm orange color as our new white point, we're essentially neutralizing that color and essentially removing the warmth from our image. Now, if instead we want to neutralize this cool blue light from the sky, we can set that as our new white point. So if we click the white point color swatch and use our color picker, and we can just grab it right off the render, and we see it gets neutralized and essentially removed from our image. Okay, so that's the white point function. We'll set that back to white. Next, let's talk about this vignette feature. So this one's pretty straightforward. Of course, it simulates the edge darkening effect that can happen in real life cameras with imperfect lenses. It's basically one single value that the higher it goes, the more intense the effect is. So right now it's at 5. But if we up this to 50, for instance, or something like 15, we can see the effect happening around the edges of our frame here. I like to set it at 5 and just keep it really light. Alright, finally let's take a look at this shader's tone mapping control. So tone mapping lets us manually adjust how the values from our scene will show up in our final image. Again, this is really important to control, especially when we have really high intensity lights like our physical sun, which has values that go up into the thousands, while our monitors can only typically display values between 0 and 1. So we need to be able to take these super high input values and adjust them so that they don't look completely blown out in our render. So let's look at this allowed overexposure parameter. So when something is overexposed, it means that the light intensity is so strong that it displays at pure white or close to it. This parameter here is basically asking us how much overexposure to allow in our image. If we set the allowed overexposure to 1, we're essentially telling Redshift not to do anything about these blown out values and just leave them be. On the opposite end, if we crank it way down to 0.1, we're telling Redshift that we want to allow minimal overexposure in our image, so it's going to remap our upper end values to make sure that even with really high intensity lights, we're not getting areas that are pure white. And of course that effect gradates if we set this value anywhere in between. Now if we look at these black crush threshold and black crush amount, they essentially work the same way but on the opposite end of the value spectrum. So let's look at this shadowy area down here. Right now, since our black crush amount is set to 0, the effect is essentially disabled and it's not doing anything. Now if we increase our black crush amount to 1, what it's doing is it's crushing our shadow values down closer to pure black, and it's giving us this more contrasty look in our shadows. And of course this effect will gradate if we set this value anywhere in between. Now this black crush threshold controls what input intensities are actually affected by the black crush. So right now any shadow values that are below 0.1 are going to be affected by this black crush effect. And of course any values above 0.1 are not going to be affected at all. So if we were to up this threshold to 0.6 for instance, we'll see that now our midtones are also being affected by this black crush effect, because now those midtones also fall within this black crush threshold. Okay, so that's black crush. This final parameter over here, of course, is our saturation control, and this one's also really straightforward. When it's at 1, obviously it's not doing anything, but you know, if we drop this down to 0.1, we see all of our saturation. We can leave our image and we can say double it to super saturate our image, and we'll just set that back to 1. Finally, down here we have this visualization tool. This graph is essentially showing us what our tone mapping adjustments are doing to our image. So the x-axis is our input values, basically the values that are being calculated in our scene before our tone mapping adjustments, and the vertical y-axis is our output. So these are the output values after our tone mapping adjustments. And here where these two lines cross is the 1-to-1 point. Right now we can see that these values are curved somewhat because of the adjustments that we've made up here. Now if we were to neutralize these tone mapping adjustments and update our graph here, we'll see that it goes back to being a straight 1-to-1 line. And we'll see if we go back to adjusting our allowed overexposure, it curves it back down. And if we adjust our black crush amount, we update it, we'll see a dip down here in the lower end. So it's a pretty neat visualization tool, and that's pretty much it for the photographic exposure lens shader. In the next part we'll dive into the bokeh shader.